So welcome back. This is session 2 of Confident Faith, Apologetics for Everyone. In the last session, we introduced the importance of having a thoughtful faith that's not afraid to engage with the heartfelt concerns and intellectual objections people might have about belief in God or Jesus or the Bible.
And that these tough questions are usually motivated by one of 3 meta questions. Is it true? Is it good? Does it work?
In this session, we're going to consider the first of those 3 questions, is it true? And in this session in particular, the question, is God true?
Now, I wonder if you've ever heard the strange story about the man who believed he was dead. This poor man's family tried as best they could to convince him that he wasn't dead, but he would not be persuaded. Finally, in desperation, they took him to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist tried various tactics, but nothing worked. Eventually, the psychiatrist decided, if I can, just convince him of one fact that contradicts his belief that he's dead, that should cure him. So he decides to use the simple truth that dead men do not bleed. He gives the man some medical texts to read, has him observe some autopsies and talk with other doctors until finally, after several weeks, the man says, okay, you've convinced me. Dead men do not bleed. Now, immediately, the psychiatrist sticks him in the arm with a needle, and as the blood flows, the man looks down at his arm with a shocked look on his face and says, "Good grief, I don't believe it. Dead men do bleed after all." All right, so you're probably wondering, why is he sharing this ridiculous story? Well, actually, it's because, unfortunately, it represents the sort of belief that Christians are sometimes caricatured as having because of their belief in God. That's to say, a completely irrational belief, a blind faith that people stubbornly cling to against all the weight of reason or evidence against it.
And because of this caricature of what belief in God is like, many in our society today reject Christianity before they've even had a chance to look at it, which is why helping people to see that there are good reasons to believe in God can be so powerful and is often the thing God uses to kickstart a person's journey towards faith.
And there are good reasons to believe in God. For example, one of the reasons many throughout history have believed that there might be a God comes from the deep sense of wonder and awe we tend to experience as human beings when we look at the natural world around us. The exquisite beauty of the cosmos, the serenity of a sunset, the grandeur of a majestic mountain range, or the incredible intricacy of the human body and the way its different systems work together. Albert Einstein, speaking of this mysterious wonder, wrote, "He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed."
The Bible teaches us that the awe and wonder we experience in response to what really is an amazing world around us should naturally lead our minds to the person who made this amazing world around us. In the same way, the artist is evident in great art or a designer in great design.
The Jewish king and poet David writes, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." David was firmly of the view that the awe-inspiring world around us points beyond itself to a creator.
And he's not alone. Many great thinkers throughout history have spoken of how the universe evidences an overwhelming impression of order and design, from which it is entirely rational to infer an orderer or a designer behind it all.
Right, but sometimes you'll hear atheists suggesting that science, which studies the physical universe, has somehow disproved or done away with God.
I know that's the case for me. I remember my science teacher at school suggesting I was somehow naive or irrational for believing in a creator God. And since he clearly knew more about science than I did, I was just a simple school student, it made me wonder what he knew that I didn't, and whether, when really put to the test, my faith in God was truly rational. So let's consider this objection, which is one of the most common objections to belief in God, the claim that science has done away with God. Is it true? Has science done away with God?
Great question, Tash. The short answer to that question is that science has not done away with God. Why? Because science and belief in God are mutually affirming of one another. Far from being foes, they're actually friends. And we would love to share with you 5 reasons for why that is the case.
5 reasons for why science and belief in God are mutually affirming and compatible.
So get your science geek on. We are going overdrive. So reason 1. Many of our world's leading scientists today are believers in God. Let me mention just a few. Francis Collins, former head of the Human Genome Project; Richard Smalley, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry; Charles H. Townes, Nobel Prize winner in physics; Werner Aber, a Nobel Prize winner in medicine; Joseph Murray, a Nobel Prize winner in physiology; and Don Page, the renowned theoretical physicist who studied under Stephen Hawking. I could mention my own Nobel Prize, but that would be boasting. Anyway, the testimony of these and many other top scientists is that their study of the physical universe has strengthened their belief in an intelligent creator God behind it all. Leading nanotechnologist James Tour, for example, writes, "Only a rookie who knows nothing about science would say science takes away from faith. If you really study science, it will bring you closer to God."
So if someone tells you that science has done away with God, you might want to ask them what it is that they know that these world-leading scientists do not.
Reason number 2. Modern science was largely birthed by thinkers who believed in God. People such as Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, and Pascal, and that's no accident. C.S. Lewis observes, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. For example, Johannes Kepler, a key figure of the scientific revolution, wrote that the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. Likewise, Isaac Newton, in his famous Principia Mathematica, real tongue twister, expressed his dedication to God as the one who governs all things and from whom this most beautiful system of sun, planets and comets could alone proceed.
Reason number 3, science and belief in God are concerned with answering different questions. So they're not opposed to one another. Science is concerned with answering the what and how questions of the universe, but not the big why questions of meaning and purpose or God. Science is wonderful, but as the Nobel Prize winning scientist Sir Peter Medawar observes, science is also limited. It can't answer the typical questions of a child, like, what am I here for? What's the purpose of life? Is there a God?
Even if scientists of the future were to one day figure out how all the different components of the universe work together, this would no more disprove the existence of God than does a mechanic figuring out how all the different parts of a motor car work together disprove the existence of a Henry Ford. Or if it's an electric car, it would be probably Elon Musk, right? But the point is, science and faith, they don't compete, because they're answering different questions.
Reason number 4, belief in a creator God offers a more rational basis for the discipline of science than does non-belief. As Oxford professor John Lennox observes, science is deeply dependent on an act of faith, that is, a firm belief in the fundamental intelligibility of the universe.
However, if one believes in a godless universe where everything that exists, including our minds, is the product of natural, unplanned and unguided processes, why should we trust that anything our minds tell us about the universe is true? How could that be anything but a blind faith? In contrast, we have good reason to believe in the intelligibility of the universe if both it and our minds are the product of an intelligent mind behind it all.
And finally, reason 5, although science can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God, it does provide us with clues that point heavily in favour of God.
Some people might find that surprising because they've been led to believe that Darwin's theory of evolution swung the evidence in favour of atheism by doing away with the need for God, when in fact what Darwin did was provide us with a theory about how we could move from simple forms of biological life, like the humble bacterium, to complex forms of life, like you and me. And of course, some of us are more complex than others, but his theory doesn't explain or even attempt to explain the far more fundamental questions of how life could even begin in the first place and how it is that we live in a universe capable of sustaining that life.
It's when we attempt to answer those fundamental questions that we find the scientific data providing us with powerful evidence or clues pointing towards the existence of a grand designer behind it all. So let's have a look at these clues.
That's a great idea. The first clue is the discovery in the 20th century that the universe had a beginning, which of course is what the Bible has always taught. Interestingly, it was the Catholic priest and theoretical physicist Georges Lemaitre who persuasively theorized in the 1920s that the universe had a beginning, sometimes referred to as the Big Bang. Took the scientific community by storm. Prior to that, many atheist thinkers in particular believed the universe had always existed, just eternally. And then in 1929, Lemaitre's theory that the universe had a beginning was affirmed by Hubble's telescope and his discovery that the universe was expanding. And then the theory was later verified in 1965 by the discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation in the universe, a residual echo of the Big Bang.
Now don't worry, you don't need to remember all those details or dates. There's no test afterwards. The important point is that the scientific consensus now, based on the evidence, is that the universe had a beginning. And this really is a big deal, because now we're presented with an obvious question, which is, what caused the universe to just begin?
For we know from reason and experience that whatever begins to exist must have a cause. One of the oldest dictums in philosophy is ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. In other words, whatever begins must have a cause. The universe could not have created itself, because to create itself, the universe would have to exist before it existed, which is logically incoherent. Therefore, the cause for the universe must lie outside of the universe itself, and this cause must somehow transcend both energy and matter as well as space and time, since it created these things. Thus, the cause of the universe must be non-physical and immaterial and beyond space and time. And there are only two sorts of objects that could fit that description. Either an abstract object like a number, or else an immaterial mind. But abstract objects like the number 6 can't cause anything to happen. So the cause of the universe must be a transcendent mind, an unembodied personal being, which is just what believers understand God to be.
And as to the very common follow-up question, which is, well, if God created the universe, who created God? The answer is that God doesn't require a prior cause, because unlike our universe, God didn't have a beginning. He is, by definition, eternal, which means there is no logical or scientific reason to hold that he needed to have a cause outside of himself.
A second big clue from science for a creator God is the recent discovery by physicists of something called the fine-tuning of the universe. You see, we tend to take it for granted that we live in a life-permitting universe. It's easy to do until you realize just how incredibly precise and finely tuned the fundamental physical constants of our universe needed to be right from the very beginning for life to exist.
For example, scientists have discovered that had the force of gravity in our universe been any greater or lesser by just the unimaginably smallest of margins, a fraction of 1 over 10 to the power 40, there would be no life.
Or had the ratio of electrons to protons in the universe been any greater or lesser by a fraction of 1 over 10 to the power of 37, there would be no life.
Or had dark energy been any greater or lesser by a fraction of 1 over 10 to the power of 120, there would be no life. To give you a sense of the magnitude of these numbers, it helps to bear in mind that the number of atoms in the whole universe is only about 10 to the power of 80.
So let's just think about that for a moment. If there's no God and the universe is completely unguided, it means that every single one of these fundamental physical constants, and there are at least 30 or more of them, had to have been precisely the right magnitude required right from the very beginning of the universe, completely by chance. Like a gigantic radio, if you can imagine it, with more than 30 dials, where we don't get any music from the radio station unless each and every dial is finely tuned to a very particular frequency, but where the chance of just one of them landing on the right frequency for that dial by chance is less than a billionth of a percent.
For every single one of the 30 or more fundamental physical constants of the universe to have been exactly the right magnitude for life, completely by chance, right at the very beginning of the universe, given the incredibly minute precision we're talking about here, defies reasonable belief. Because it's not as if the universe had untold billions of years to get this fine-tuning for life right. It had to be right from the very beginning. This was a one-shot deal.
Exactly. The odds have been compared to the odds of firing a bullet at a 1-inch target on the other side of the observable universe, 20 billion light years away, while blindfolded, bang, and hitting the target straight on. And you only get, as Tash said, one shot.
And yet here we are.
And yet here we are. As Stanford physicist Leonard Susskind puts it, on the knife edge of existence. The fine-tuning of the universe strongly suggests that we came to be here not by chance, but by design, with a precision and an exactitude that no human designer could ever dream of achieving. As the physicist Paul Davies, who's not a believer, writes, scientists are slowly waking up to the inconvenient truth the universe looks suspiciously like a fix. Or as the atheist cosmologist Sir Fred Hoyle put it, it's as if a superintellect has monkeyed with the physics.
And so there you have it. 5 reasons why science and belief in God are not enemies, but friends. Friends, in fact, from the beginning and still very much today, showing us that the more we learn about this awe-inspiring universe that we live in, the closer it can bring us to the God who made it. Take a moment now to pause for discussion and think about which of the 5 reasons you found most helpful or compelling. After that, we will return to look at another piece of evidence for God's existence, this time evidence not from the world around us, but from the world within us.
Welcome back to the second half of session 2.
As well as there being evidence for God from science and the world around us, we also have evidence for God from human experience and the world within us. For example, our consciousness, rationality, morality, imagination, and spiritual longings are all aspects of the human experience that many thinkers throughout history have considered to be compelling evidence for the existence of God. In this section, we're going to focus on one of these, morality.
It was the philosopher Immanuel Kant who said, 2 things fill the mind with ever-increasing awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me.
Shortly after the Second World War, leading Nazi officers responsible for atrocities committed in the dreaded concentration camps were tried in Nuremberg by the International Criminal Court. They were condemned as guilty of punishment, even though, as the officers' defense lawyers argued, these men were simply acting in accordance with the law of the land at the time. Why? Because the judges of the International Criminal Court recognized a higher law to which we are all accountable. One that cannot be erased simply with the stroke of a legislative pen or a shift in popular opinion.
As human beings, we intuitively recognize the existence of this higher law. As the philosopher Alvin Plantinga once put it, it is extremely difficult to be a human being and not think that some actions are right and others wrong. Have you ever wondered why that is? Animals don't seem to care about ethics or morality, so why do we? For animals, it's the law of the jungle. For us, we're also aware of another law, a moral law. For example, what do we call someone who acts without regard to a moral law? An animal. And it's not a term of endearment.
The Bible teaches us that God is the author of the moral law and that our awareness of it is something that He has implanted in us as beings made in His image. In Romans chapter 2, verses 14 to 15, we read, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them."
Historically, philosophers, ancient and modern, have argued that an objective moral law points to the existence of God as the only good explanation for that law. And what they mean by an objective moral law is one that is binding on all of us as human beings, whether we believe it or not, or whether we like it or not. This argument is sometimes called the moral argument for God's existence.
And it's a strong argument because in order to rebut it, you either have to deny the existence of an objective moral law, or you have to offer a good explanation for an objective morality in something other than God, both of which are difficult to do. Those who deny the existence of an objective moral law must be willing to affirm that things such as racism or sexism or child abuse are not objectively wrong, which fewer philosophers today are inclined to do, not least because such a view runs counter to some of our deepest intuitions as human beings.
Whereas those who would uphold the existence of an objective moral law, but without God, face the immense challenge of explaining from whence such a law could derive, because as the atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie famously pointed out, It would be very strange for moral facts to somehow just exist in an impersonal and purposeless universe in which everything ultimately reduces to the basic particles of physics. For how would such a universe have an opinion about anything, let alone an opinion about how we ought to live our lives?
But let's look at 3 of the most popular attempts to explain the existence of an objective moral law without God.
The first argues that human beings can create their own objective morality, that we can decide for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. We can decide, for example, that racism is wrong. But if that's the case, what if someone else decides for themselves that racism is not wrong? On what basis can we tell a racist that they're wrong if we believe that human beings decide for themselves what's right and wrong?
You see the problem. It's the problem highlighted centuries ago by the atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, which is that if you say that humankind gets to decide what's wrong and what's right, the next question becomes which human being? Mother Teresa or Adolf Hitler? Florence Nightingale or Joseph Stalin? You or me?
Yeah, probably you would be better. But the second attempt argues that reason itself requires that we act morally. Rationality itself requires that we ought to treat others the way we would like to be treated ourselves. And the argument is that if reasonable people value themselves as human beings, it stands to reason that they ought also to value others as human beings as well.
However, the problem with this argument is that it does not follow in logic that because I value myself as a human being, I must also value my neighbour as a human being as well. For I might in fact be a complete egoist.
You're not, but you might be, and I might be, and I might value my humanity for what it gives me, life, imagination, rationality, while at the same time being completely indifferent to the fact that my neighbour's humanity gives my neighbour the same things. In fact, I might even find my neighbour's humanity to be a complete nuisance and wish they didn't even exist. I wonder if you've ever had a neighbour like that. And the thing is, reason alone cannot tell me that I'm wrong to think or act like that. Reason alone cannot tell me why I ought to value my neighbour for my neighbour's sake rather than for what they can give me, i.e. for my sake. As the atheist philosopher Kai Nelson acknowledges, we have not been able to show that all really rational persons should not be selfish or amoral. Reason doesn't decide here.
The other popular attempt to explain morality without God is in terms of human evolution. The argument being that because we have naturally evolved as social creatures, this is an adequate foundation for an objective morality.
But the problem with this argument, as the psychologist Jonathan Haidt observes, is that the story of human evolution is not only the story of human beings being social with each other, it's also the story of human beings competing with each other and often violently. As the renowned anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss explains, all the evidence tells us that human beings have naturally dismissed or despised those who are not from their own tribe or people group.
So, for example, throughout history, some people groups have claimed that we are the civilized and they are the barbarians, or that we are descended from the gods and they are descended from the dirt, or that we are born to lead and they are born to serve. And ironically, some groups have even used evolutionary theory to claim that we are the highly evolved and those other races are the lesser evolved.
Another problem with trying to ground morality in evolution is that among the list of universal human desires which evolutionary biologists tell us are rooted in our human nature are the desire for war, and in men the desire for dominance, neither of which represent a promising foundation on which to establish a moral framework, particularly the desire for dominance, which would seem rather to legitimize such things as slavery and sexual oppression, which are activities that clearly violate morality rather than promote it.
And finally, the most fundamental problem with looking to evolutionary biology as a basis for morality is that, like any science, it is descriptive rather than prescriptive. It can only tell us what is, not what ought to be.
So there you have it. Having looked at 3 of the most common attempts to explain an objective moral law in something other than God, human decision, human reason, and human evolution, we've seen that none of them are ultimately satisfactory. In fact, it is arguable that no adequate or robust secular explanation for an objective moral law has yet been found. In our view, trying to account for an objective moral law without an objective moral lawgiver is a bit like trying to imagine a story without a storyteller, or a judgment without a judge. It just doesn't make sense. And so, as I hope you can see, the existence of an objective moral law offers a profoundly compelling argument for God's existence.
So let's recap what we've covered in this session. For those looking for objective reasons and evidence for belief in God, we've considered two very compelling sources. The evidence that we have from the world around us,
much of which we know from modern science,
as well as the evidence that we have from the world within us.
And particularly in our awareness of an objective moral law telling us that some things really are right and other things really wrong.
So when people ask you the question, is it true? Is God true? You can be confident not only that God is true, but that there are good reasons and evidence that you can point people to help them see that He's true as well, and that those reasons and evidence are accessible to everyone. We look forward to seeing you in our next session, session 3, as we transition from the question, is God true, to the question, is Christianity true?